afternoon, in as much as it is afternoon. It's almost 5 minutes past 12, and this was to begin at 12 o'clock. And though it is not a very nice day out, we thought we'd get started with Professor Buhl's lecture. My name is David Thomas. I'm in the Department of History at Rhode Island College, and it is my distinct professional pleasure to introduce Dr. Buhle. Dr. Buhle holds an appointment of position at Brown University, where she is currently Associate Professor of History and American Civilization. She is as well a member of the Pembroke Center at Brown University. She has published extensively in the field of women's history, with her two most recent monographs being Women and American Socialism, 1870 to 1920, published by the University of Illinois Press in 1981, and Women and the American Left, a guide to sources, appearing in 1983. In addition, Professor Buhle has many articles to her credit. It's quite a long list, and I won't go over it with you, but you may ask her afterwards if you wish. But in any event, the following gives some indication of her range of scholarship. For example, comment on women in the Socialist Party bureaucracy, and From Sisterhood to Self, Women's Road to Advancement in the early 20th century have recently appeared. She has also co-edited with her husband a concise history of women's suffrage. It is indeed our good fortune at Rhode Island College, and we wish to thank the Women's Studies program very much for affording us this opportunity to have Professor Buhle with us today. Finally, let me invite all of you on behalf of the Women's Studies program, as well as the other participating departments, those of you who can and those of you who wish to join us in the Faculty Center immediately following Professor Buhle's lecture for a lunch, informal lunch. Professor Buhle?
In the late 1960s, when historians turned again to study American women, they surveyed the literature produced by the pioneers who opened this field at the turn of the century between 1880 and 1920. And they found there, for the most part, a series of books and essays which stressed women's accomplishment in public life. They found there biographies of leading scientists, educators, artists, literary figures, as a convincing evidence at the time to women's growing contribution to the world of work outside the home. Contemporary surveys of women's leadership in charitable enterprises and their important role in civic reform added yet another dimension to what was then seen as a very convincing document of the story of progress. But central to most of these works was the story for women's struggle for political rights. And eventually this story superseded all others, so that by 1920 already, the history of women in the United States meant the history of women's suffrage. And for the decades to come, the standard textbooks on U.S. history confirmed this conclusion, mentioning women, if at all, primarily in relation to the historic century of struggle for the ballot. The scholars of the 1960s, influenced to a large degree by the women's liberation movement of that era, rejected this version of women's history. In the first place, they realized that the passage of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in 1920 had not significantly changed women's status to any significant degree. And second, they questioned the prominence accorded the women's suffrage movement itself, speculating that perhaps only a narrow spectrum of American women had actually joined in this particular struggle. The history of American women, they insisted, should tap the experiences of the female majority, not merely the contributions of atypical activists. Determined to widen the scope of historical inquiry, scholars in the 1960s and early 1970s took up the more social, economic, and cultural aspects of women's past lives. As a result of this legacy in the scholarship, we have a very thin picture of the history of American feminism. Although, for example, there are excellent studies on the first women to enter the textile factories in Lowell or Lawrence, Massachusetts, or excellent studies of the cult of domesticity, which allegedly flourished among the middle classes in the 19th century, only a few publications have served to update the historiography of women's political involvement. Recently, however, some historians have returned to the subjects that seem to have originally sparked the interest in that first generation of scholars at the turn of the century. Political history is indeed coming back into vogue, although on different terms from its first incarnation. Historians now place women's suffrage within a much larger context of political activity, and consequently realize that if perhaps not a majority, then a wide range of women actually participated in what we now see as an impressively large movement, a multifaceted movement for women's advancement in the 19th century. Equally important, these historians are determinedly reaping the fruit of their peers' work in social and cultural history and bringing entirely new questions into their study of American feminism. Old myths are passing. For example, many scholars now feel that the women's movement did not reach its demise in 1920, that indeed the struggle for different types of reforms continued well into the 20s and into the 1930s. Also, they speculate that the issue of political rights, of the struggle for women's suffrage itself, did not predominate over all other issues in the 19th century. And these, as well as many other myths that we have about the history of American feminism, seem to be passing away as scholars are returning to this area of investigation. My own work on this area centers on the Gilded Age, the 3 decades after the Civil War. And this particular period presents, I believe, several opportunities for re-exploring this history of American feminism. This era witnessed the emergence of the first truly large-scale women's movement in American history, a movement with a rather complex agenda and structure. And the era's activists, of course, endorsed the campaign for women's suffrage, but what interests me the most is the fact in their everyday lives they tended to devote their energies to a variety of programs to advance women's cause in what we would see as a more immediate or practical fashion. It might be fair to state that the Gilded Age women's movement stands out in history precisely because women's suffrage played such a minor role compared to other types of demands, particularly economic demands, such as women's right to participate fully and freely in wage labor. The Gilded Age women's movement comprised hundreds, literally hundreds, of local organizations and institutions. These organizations were bureaucratically distinct from one another, but if you look at them together, they tend to unite in a common philosophical purpose. They tended to have a single agenda to advance women's positions as they move from a strictly domestic role to larger roles outside of the home. Gilded Age activists sponsored a variety of programs designed to improve the status of women in the labor force, as well as to better the conditions of their working lives. Although many of these activists were quite comfortable themselves, they readily reached out to self-supporting women in American society, particularly women who had few resources, and particularly women who were without families to depend upon. These were mostly young women who were flocking into the cities in search for work or education. They sometimes were older women who had fallen on hard times due to the death or desertion of their male provider, and to assist women who seemed to be in less fortunate circumstances than themselves many of these women turned to offer what we would see as basic services, such as low-cost boarding facilities, day nurseries, and kindergartens for their children, employment agencies so that they could find better jobs, systems of referral to legal, medical, and religious advice in the anonymous city. And added to these kinds of services were a variety of programs designed to upgrade the skills to make women better competitors in the expanding labor market. Some of these mostly local organizations affiliated by the end of the century into national enterprises. The Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, which formed in American cities in the late 1860s, claimed by 1906 over 106 local chapters. Others of these organizations remain strictly local affairs, such as one called the Philadelphia Boarding Home for Young Women, which was opened in October 1865, is one of the first public boarding houses for working women in American cities. Perhaps the most elaborate and long-lasting was the Boston Women's Educational and Industrial Union, which sponsored an impressively long list of programs and services. The Boston Union, which was founded in 1877, served as a model for similar institutions in at least 13 other cities, and it still stands today in downtown Boston. The Women's Educational and Industrial Union was, in fact, at the center of a very impressive circle of women's organizations in the city of Boston. And what I would like to do today is to share with you some of my research on these women's organizations in the city of Boston at the end of the 19th century, to share with you some of my understanding of what their intentions were and what their connections are to the history of American feminism. Boston itself has a rather long history of women's organization and public activism. Of course, it is a home in the 1870s and 1880s of many former abolitionist women, and many early women's rights activists, women suffragists themselves, moved to Boston to take part in what was conceived of as a political community of women. It was the organizational headquarters of the American Women's Suffrage Association, the home of its venerable leader, Lucy Stone. It also was the place of publication of the era's leading feminist publication called the Women's Journal. Boston also had a rich heritage of women's participation in mostly charitable enterprises dating all the way back to the late 1800s, when groups of women responded to the growing number of poor in the city of Boston who happened to be mostly women and their dependent children. Such organizations as the New England Female Reform Society, the Society for the Employment of the Female Poor, the Association for the Relief of Aged and Indigent Females, among others, had worked in various ways throughout the 19th century to assist mostly needy women. In the years after the Civil War in Boston, organizations multiplied at a very fast pace. By the mid-1980s, the Boston Almanac and Business Directory listed over 30 societies which were directed solely by women and serving only women as their clients. And these range from some rather innocuous charitable affairs such as the Boston Sewing Circle, where women gathered to make garments for the city's poor, to the Episcopal Girls Friendly Society, which had sort of little tea parties for working girls in the afternoon, to the Massachusetts Society for the Promotion of University Education for Women, the New England Women's Suffrage Society, the Ladies Physiological Institute, which offered health classes for women, to the Penitent Female Refuge Society, which offered a halfway station for women who were coming out of prisons, to the Boston Temporary Home for Working Women, for women who were coming into the city without family and needed a place to stay for a short period. Another organization called the Women's Economic Garden and Homestead League, for example, aspired to provide working-class retired women with their own property and comfortable homes outside of the city. The Boston Cooking School, to really exhaust this list, aimed to make domestics better candidates for wage labor. in well-paying service positions. And then finally, the Women's Education Association conducted a half dozen special vocational education classes for women while campaigning to ask Harvard University to open its doors to female students. Now, an important sector of these kinds of organizations, of which there were at least 30 by the 1880s, an important sector of these kinds of organizations addressed itself principally to the needs of self-supporting women in the city of Boston. Indeed, this particular population of wage-earning women was a very important one because it was growing at a relatively rapid pace in the decades after the Civil War. Sizable populations of young women were coming into the city looking for gainful employment. They hailed from the nearby New England states of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. They came from the British territories in northern Canada. They came from abroad, from the British Isles, mainly from Ireland. And then toward the end of the century, around the late 1880s and 1890s, they were beginning to come from Eastern European countries. But the majority of women who were coming into Boston after the Civil War in the 70s and early 1880s were mostly either of British or American stock. They tended to be, for the most part, native-born or Canadian. They tended to be English-speaking, and they tended also to be either Protestant or Catholic. They filled a variety of positions which were opening to women in these years. The largest numbers worked as domestic servants. In fact, Boston had the highest ratio of homes to servants of any northern city in the United States. A large number were working in the city's growing needle trades. During the war, the production of uniforms for the Army gave a real important boost to the city's garment industry. And in the 1860s and 1870s, the switch to peacetime production centered on the production of cheap, ready-to-wear men's garments. And large numbers of women were finding their first jobs in this growing needlework industry. Others were moving into retail sales and clerical work, and a very small but actually very prestigious sector of women were working in professional occupations as the first physicians, educators, ministers, and lawyers in the city of Boston. Now, with this particular growing population of women who were attempting to earn wages and to actually live and survive off these wages, sometimes removed from their parental families, the city's women's organizations in the 1870s and 1880s began to respond by developing a range of services directed precisely toward this particular group. The directors of these organizations named low wages the bane of women's existence, and they aimed to improve the conditions of women's labor as well as to assist women in finding better paying jobs, especially outside of the garment industry and domestic servants. Although they hoped to reach that particular population, they really aspired to improve all women's chances to advance in wage labor, to push them into a new and perhaps better paying situation in the clerical and retail sales. And through a variety of means, these organizations issued a very fundamental premise that I think stays with us today, that all women, regardless of their social situation, have an individual claim to a good job, a fair job, a well-paying job for their own self-support. Now, one of the oldest and the most enduring women's organizations to develop in the mid-1860s with this particular principle at the foremost of its agenda was the Boston Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, which today we usually associate with athletic or sports programs for young women. Well, actually, the Y, as it was founded in Boston in the 1860s, came as a result of the work of a very small group of mostly evangelical Protestant women who wanted to open a residence, a boarding residence for other Protestant women who were coming into the city looking for work. They tried in the 1850s to establish a boarding home for working women, but the ministers in the city of Boston said that this was inappropriate activity for women to do. It perhaps would demean their particular character. and they convinced them during the war to put off this kind of enterprise. Well, these women got together as soon as the war closed and were determined to set up a boarding facility. They met together, they did some fundraising among their friends and neighbors, and by 1874 they had enough money to open the Warrenton Street Home for working women in the city of Boston. This home provided in 1874 residential accommodations for over 200 working women. In addition to this first boarding facilities for young women, the YWCA's mainspring became its educational and employment referral programs in the 1870s. By 1891, at its 25th anniversary, the Boston YWCA offered an extensive array of vocational educational courses, ranging from courses in domestic science to the industrial arts. They offered courses on plumbing, carpentry, woodworking, various kinds of industrial skill jobs, as well as better skilled dressmaking and millinery occupations for those women already in the needle trades. They added, perhaps, which was the most popular curriculum at the Y, typing and stenography and home nursing courses. Now, it's interesting that the Y opened these courses because if you were a woman in Boston in the 1870s, there were very few other places where you could actually study these kinds of subjects. The public and private schools did not offer curriculum in any of these particular subjects, so that the Y's resources were essential to women hoping to move into these particular occupational categories. In addition to sponsoring these kinds of vocational education courses, the Y had something called its General Employment Department, which had annually placed something like 2,500 women in jobs in the city of Boston. In designing these programs, the organizers of the Boston Y hoped, as they said, to assist the city's growing population of working women. They said in one of their annual reports that they thanked God for compelling women to be workers, not drones, in this busy world, and for making it possible that a larger proportion, not of men only, but also of women, should procure the necessities of life by their own labor. But, they added, much may be done to make the state of things more a blessing than they are at present. They stated in their annual reports 3 goals. One was to increase and develop women's skills so that they would be more effective competitors in the labor market. Secondly, they issued a public demand that included just payment for women's labor as well as equal wages for work performed by men and women. And finally, they had the intention to gratify the intellectual and spiritual needs of working women, especially those without friends and family in the city of Boston. The Boston YWCA succeeded in the Gilded Age in reaching only a narrow spectrum of the city's working women. The boarders in 1890 were only about 400 permanent residents and something like 300 transient visitors. They were mostly native-born white Protestant women under the age of 25. They did represent a variety of occupations, although most of the people who lived or took advantage of the Y's facilities worked in the city's garment industry and its related branches or attended school. The Boston Association did not admit blacks. By 1890 only, it developed a program for assisting immigrants. Its Travelers Aid Department, which was developed in this year, met nearly 500 transatlantic steamers coming into the city of Boston and assisted in one year something like 1,800 women who were just getting off the boat, helping them to find their first residential accommodations and their first jobs in the city of Boston. The Boston Y considered itself foremost a Christian institution closely tied to the city's evangelical churches, and it reached out mainly to young working women who already shared its religious and moral values. Despite these religious and racial limitations, it also had class and age differences which separated the directors of the Y from its clientele. The directors were fairly well-situated middle-aged women who took a very proprietary, almost patronage interest in the young women who used its facilities. The directors nevertheless aspired to distinguish between the Y's program and charity, in that they insisted that the Y be a self-supporting institution, at least partially from the low fees that they charged for room and board and educational programs. And although the director of this particular institution did not advocate trade unionism, they adamantly defended women's right to unrestricted labor and for equal wages. Self-help rather than either philanthropy or political education served their philosophical purposes. Now, the YWCA had a major counterpart in another organization that did not last to the present, a rather obscure small society called Boffin's Bower, which was founded not by a Christian evangelical middle-class woman, but by a woman who knew intimately the problems of wage-earning women in the city. This woman's name was Jenny Collins. She was born in 1828 to humble circumstances in Ameskeag, New Hampshire. She was orphaned at the age of 14 and worked her way through the mills of Lawrence and Lowell, finally to work as a domestic servant during the 1850s in the city of Boston. During the Civil War, she took up a job as a volunteer nurse, and by the end of the 1860s, she became a labor agitator in the local movement in the city of Boston. And by 1870, Jenny Collins had determined that her role in life was to serve the city's growing population of working women. She resolved, quote, to collect in a warm and well-heated bower all of the overtaxed, weary, and worn working girls, and with entertainments of music, lectures, and reading, to advance them intellectually and morally by giving them the opportunities for self-improvement. Like the YWCA, Boffin's Bower was an institution of self-help for the city's working women. In October 1870, Collins opened Boffin's Bower on Washington Street in downtown Boston, and she called it the local headquarters for working women. She ran an employment bureau to help women find jobs. She also conducted an apprenticeship program, mainly for women in the growing millinery trades. Collins also supplied a guest chamber for women who were coming into the city for work. And during the depressed time and slack seasons, she offered free meals to women who had fallen on hard times. For 16 years, Jenny Collins kept Boffin's Bower open on Washington Street. She raised funds by recruitment from the city's capitalists, asking those who employed women to return some of their profits into this particular institution. And she kept the doors open until her death in 1887. She repeatedly insisted that Boffin's Bower was not a charity organization, that it simply existed as a means of self-help, as well as to exalt the dignity of women's position in wage labor. Now, unlike the YWCA and Boffin's Bower, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union originated among women with ties to the city's premier feminist organization, the New England Women's Club, which founded the Women's Educational Industrial Union as its most cherished plan, its most aspired program. When the New England Women's Club was founded in 1868, the club members immediately set themselves into a small committee to investigate the situation of labor among the city's needlewomen. This committee in 1869 issued the first report in the city of Boston on the conditions of labor among women in the city. And they had a program that included the advocacy of the establishment of a boarding residence for the city's wage-earning women, cooking, industrial, and apprenticeship training schools, and also a kind of social club that would help women use their leisure time to their best benefit. The New England Women's Club was unsuccessful in its fundraising activities in the late 1860s, but finally in 1877, one of its members had a very viable program and recruited something like 42 other members of the New England Women's Club to found the Women's Educational and Industrial Union. Within 1 year, by 1878, the membership of this organization grew to 400, and over the next decade, the membership tripled. Now, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union replicated many of the programs that the Y and Boffin's Bower had already originated. It had an industrial department where it allowed any woman who had a good that she produced mainly in her own home to sell it on a retail market and to take the profit from it. It had something called the Employment Committee, where it maintained a job registry for those seeking work. It had a lunch committee, which operated a low-cost restaurant, really one of the very few where wage-earning women could get a cheap, decent meal in the city of Boston. It had a protective committee where women lawyers volunteered their time to help women who were routinely cheated out of their wages by unscrupulous employers who would often promise to train you into certain jobs. Then as soon as you learned that and did that task for free, they dismissed you. The protective committee tried to intervene in that particular situation to assure women that they would get their wages for that training period. It had something called the Befriending Committee, which oversaw a mutual sick benefit association and assisted women who were unable to work because of illness for a period. But perhaps its most popular service was in the hands of its Reception Committee, which assisted a paid superintendent in keeping open the union's large building on Boylston Street in downtown Boston. In 1890, this Reception Committee greeted an average of 114 visitors coming into the city looking for referral to other kinds of programs. And this committee kept a list of hospitals for women and children, a list of apartments and boarding houses that women could take advantage, a list of day nurseries and other kinds of social centers. It was in what we would call today the very first women's center in the city of Boston. Now, to complement these particular programs for mostly wage-earning or working-class women, the union added a unique component, programs for professional women. The mostly middle-class women who planned the extensive array of social and educational services actually shared the facilities of the union with wage-earning women in the 1870s and 1880s, and similarly used these facilities to develop their own professional skill. Many of these women were embarking on new careers for women in medicine, in the law, in ministry, and had not that established network of connections that was so important to the established men in those particular professions. They, too, gathered in the Women's Educational Industrial Union, and not only to achieve those kind of networks, but they also used the facilities in connection with the working class women that came into them. They offered medical assistance. They operated a clinic for working women. They offered the legal referral programs. They even conducted alternative feminist Sunday religious services when they could not get a pulpit in Boston's churches. In other words, there was some kind of reciprocal exchange between the patrons and the clients in this particular institution. Now, unlike the YWCA and Boston's Bauer, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union actually aspired to bridge the class differences among the various women who used and directed its facilities. Its founder expressed this intention very clearly. She said to aid, strengthen, and elevate women by drawing them into a bond of unity. Its constitution stated the goal to increase fellowship among women in order to promote the best practical methods for their educational, industrial, and social advancement. The union's second president reaffirmed this principle. She said, "The union aims to improve the condition of women, physically, intellectually, and spiritually, of all women. The union is a union. It is not two divisions, the rich reaching down to help the poor, reaching up to be helped. It recognized the fact that there is worse than money poverty, that the women possessed of all the resources of wealth may still have needs." And this universality of needs place all on a kind of equality. The social intercourse of the union recognizes this idea of equality. We meet not purse to purse, or talent to talent, or acquirement to acquirement, but heart to heart, on the common ground of humanity. This woman believes that the union would flourish only if women of varying social positions took part in its affair. Middle-class women, she assumed, enjoyed certain resources, such as better education and proximity to men in positions of political power, and they could contribute accordingly. Working-class women, on the other hand, held an equally precious gift, which the organizers hoped to spread among all women. They had a sense of practicality, a respect for honest, hard labor, and they had ties to the city's majority, the city's working class. Like Bauer and the YWCA, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union intended to advance women's position in American society, but only the union attempted to do so by expanding the principle of self-help to include the reciprocal benefits of cross-class association. Now, the achievements of the Boston Women's Educational Industrial Union did not close off the world of philanthropy, despite its intentions. The sympathetic concern of socially comfortable directors guaranteed an element of patronage regardless of their professed sentiments of sisterhood. In many instances, class differences proved insuperable, and their dreams went unfulfilled. And indeed, the union's most successful programs throughout the 1890s addressed the women of the aspiring professional classes who benefited most from the spirit of camaraderie and mutual encouragement. And despite the union's own feeling about the special nature of its program, it operated alongside similar institutions, and actually directors and clients passed back and forth among these various institutions, one day going to the Y, the next day going to Bauer, the next day going to the Women's Educational Industrial Union, and they never really noticed the differences between these particular societies. But whatever their shortcomings and their actual achievements, these institutions made a decisive impact on the entire women's movement of the Gilded Age. Despite their differences, the Protestant evangelical orientation of the Boston YWCA, the secular principles of Bauer with close ties to the city's labor movement, the avowedly feminist intentions of the Boston Women's Educational Industrial Union, these three organizations shared something in common, something very important. They offered nearly identical services to the growing population of wage-earning women in the city of Boston, and most important, they agreed on a common agenda to advance women's right to labor outside the home. Now, in designing these programs to advance women's status in the labor market, Boston women were quite good at what they did, but they were by no means exceptional in the broad history of the United States. By the late 1880s, Chicago women had developed a vast network of similar organizations equally committed to this principle of women's right to labor. In 1888, 30 local women's organizations, including women's trade unions, joined to form something called the Illinois Women's Alliance, which was perhaps the most successful cross-class organization in the 19th century and probably of all American history. The alliance aimed to encourage unionization among the city's working women and additionally sponsored a variety of programs to improve their conditions of labor. It campaigned for compulsory education to reduce child labor in the state, for the inspection of factories and all state institutions which house women and children, for an assortment of measures such as the establishment of public bathhouses in the city's working class neighborhoods, to a protection campaign directed against the city's police who routinely harass prostitutes rather than their clients. Its most highly publicized campaign addressed the evils of sweatshop labor, which employed mostly women and children. The agitation culminated in the landmark Illinois Factory Inspection Act, which established the first woman factory investigator, Florence Kelly, in this job in 1894. And during its brief tenure of only 6 years, where 30 women's organizations joined on this common campaign to improve the situation of the city's working women, it brought together a wide range of women of different social classes and political aspirations, and levied perhaps the most significant campaign in behalf of women's right to work. Women's organizations in other cities designed similar programs. In fact, a survey in 1894 conducted by the U.S. Department of Labor of something like 1,300 women's organizations in the United States found that, quote, the science of economics is at the bottom of nearly all of their various programs. They systematically studied the position of women in the labor market and hoped to affect programs to improve their situation. Although these numerous organizations constituted a major sector of the women's movement at the end of the 19th century, actually few historians have even looked at any of their records. Even those who did underestimated their importance and misjudged their significance. William O'Neill, for example, who wrote a very important book in 1969 called Challenge the History of American Feminism in the 19th Century, but he did so by casting a pallor over all of these other activities that women did at the same time. He looked at these kinds of organizations and he called them a betrayal of what he called hardcore feminism, which he meant the women's suffrage movement, which addressed the single principle of political equality for women. When he looked at these kinds of activities, he says that rather than women holding up this principle of political equality, which to him was the litmus test of feminism, that they tended to want to change society rather than to change women's position within it. He called them social feminists, which he called a demeaning situation for American history. Historians of charity organization provide very few insights into this particular movement. They look at almost all of reform organizations at the end of the 19th century and place them under the label of social control. The middle classes trying to manipulate the lower classes to make their own position better. Now, while there is some validity to both of these contentions, I think they are limited on two grounds. First of all, women have very little power to control anyone in American society at the end of the 19th century. And secondly, I don't think the principle of economic equality pales at all to the principle of political equality. In 1870, 1 of every 4 wage earners in the United States was female. And many contemporaries realized that this proportion would grow as industrial capitalism expanded during the last decades of the 19th century. They were also acutely aware that women clustered, as they do now, in the poorest paying jobs such as needlework, or in positions of low prestige with little chance for advancement, such as domestic service. That this situation transcended class lines was readily apparent. For the first generation of aspiring professional women faced incredibly rigid obstacles in the fields of law, medicine, journalism, and education. The pioneers of women's organizations in the Gilded Age took it upon themselves to address this particular situation. They realized that there were few systems of support for any woman who hoped to survive on her own wages. Society at large seemed to subscribe tenaciously to the cult of domesticity, deeming wifehood and motherhood women's only options. Trade unions, which were eager to improve men's position in wage labor, discriminated actively against women, hoping to protect men's jobs from the competition of female workers. It was this situation where society, the state, the union movement itself offered few chances for women to improve their position in wage labor, that women's organizations stepped to the forefront. They established professional groups such as the Association for the Advancement of Women in 1873, which addressed mainly the needs of professional women, and these many other organizations ranging across the spectrum of activity. It was this situation that impelled some women to strike out, in one woman's words, as the cruel kindness of the old doctrine that women should be worked for and should not work, that their influence should be felt but not recognized, that they should hear and see but neither appear nor speak. This woman was a prominent activist in the city of Boston, and I think she best expresses the widespread sentiment among feminists in the Gilded Age. But unlike this woman, who was a prolific writer and was able to express her beliefs in political philosophy in the written text so readily accessible to historians of any generation, the majority of women in the Gilded Age were not writers or theoreticians or speakers to any renown, but instead they were activists, women who went into their community and did the work of organizational building. They ran those programs. They did the vocational educational classes. They did the referral services. And whereas one woman might express very philosophically the need for women to have political rights, another woman might act in more practical, immediate terms to fulfill them in an economic sense. And it's that history which I think has been lost to us in the 1980s. The importance of these demands of women's right to fair labor and to equal wages for equal work might be sensed by considering the most important gathering of women in the last half of the 19th century. For 8 days in March in 1888, representatives from women's organizations across the United States met in Washington, D.C. for a grand convention to, as I said, to exchange opinions on the great questions of the day. The meeting was ironically designed to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, associated historically with the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. And all the important figures of that movement were there. Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, Clara Barton, Frances Willard. Representatives from all of these women's organizations, such as the Y, the Illinois Women's Alliance, the Boston Women's Educational Union, they were all there. And after 8 days of meeting, this organization formed an umbrella network called the National Council of Women, which issued its agenda, its program for women's advancement. And one of the interesting features of this particular program is that nowhere does the demand for women's suffrage appear, but instead the cardinal tenet was equal wages for equal work. Now, this history of women's activities in the last half of the 19th century adds, I believe, an important component to our larger history of American feminism, and indeed of American women. On the one hand, it suggests that political activism was not the experience of a handful of atypical women, but was indeed central to the lives of thousands of women at the end of the 19th century. On the other hand, it does not really discount the importance of women's suffrage, but places that particular campaign within a larger context of women's activism across 3 or 4 decades. Unlike the historians of the 1960s, students today, I think, are in a better position to uncover this multidimensional history of American feminism. From the perspectives of the 1980s, when the campaign for the ERA is at low ebb, many interested parties realize that the work nevertheless goes on in very different fashion. In communities across the country, women's groups are still providing an array of services to women. Women's centers on college campuses, health clinics for women in neighborhoods, shelters for battered women, various organizations for wage-earning women and aspiring professionals. The list goes on, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. The managers of these women's organizations and institutions have a fairly clear notion about the importance of their work and its meaning in a feminist perspective. And they undoubtedly realize that even if the ERA were passed, which what I would assume a majority of them would support, as would their counterparts support women's suffrage in the 19th century, that nevertheless their energies on a day-to-day basis would be into this kind of social activism. The campaigns, the rallies, the demonstrations are one thing, but the hard work of institutions is another. The lesson, I think, from these very localized community affairs, social service organizations for women, this lesson, I think, is weighty to us as historians of American women. The history of feminism in the 1870s and 1880s could never approach any kind of meaning if, for example, historians in 30 or 40 years or in a century looked only at the organizational records of, say, the National Organization of Women. Indeed, I think that historians up until the 1960s looked only at the records of the major women's suffrage associations, and they saw a single-minded interest of mostly white upper-middle-class women in political rights. That they weren't able to do the immense work to cover systematically and comprehensively hundreds, if not thousands, of local organizations of women who had not a different, but a complementary agenda is a very interesting problem indeed. But I do think that our own sense of women activists in the 1880s will make us more sensitive to the types of evidence that we need to reconstruct what I think is a fuller, more meaningful history of women's feminist involvements across 2 centuries of continuous activism. Thank you.
Questions? Comments? Yes. Thank you very much for a very intellectually stimulating talk. She's willing to take questions. Comments from anyone?
Yes.
I have a question. When you talk about women's support movements in the Gilded Age, common denominator seems to be the voluntarism and the fact that they supported in a very pragmatic way, and that they were self-supporting.
Yes.
In modern times, the government, the United States government, has gone in a charitable organization, not as a self-help, but as a purely helping hand. Does this have a profound effect on feminism and the movement?
I do think so. I think that when the strategies shift toward these very independent-minded voluntary organizations to a reliance on the state, that a lot of the political edge was dissipated. I think that probably, given what's happened in the 1880s, that lesson is really pressing. When a lot of these women's organizations were formed in the 1970s, they were, of course, done on a voluntary basis and were dependent on fundraising techniques in the community. Very gradually, they got tied into the state and federal government for funding, and now their future is very much a problem. It's a problem that's going to last the current administration. But I think that this happened again in say, about 1900. Many of these activists turned toward the state during the Progressive era and moved into that particular system and away from voluntary associations.
How did the public view these more conservative feminist organizations? Conservative in comparison to
Much more receptively. The public really concentrated on what was seen the ultimate radicalism of women asking for the ballot. And they viewed these organizations in a much less provocative sense, probably because it was more traditional for women to be involved in charity organizations for at least a century now, that because of the ties between charity work and these particular societies, that they seem much less threatening as a population. Yes, I think so. I think they laid the basis for its revival in a later date.
I was just wondering what the WCTU was doing in Boston at the same time. How well organized were they in that same period of time when they had to do everything?
In the city of Boston, they were not as well organized as they were in other cities. In the city of Chicago, they actually had a whole list of social services, including resident houses, apprenticeship programs that replicated these. In Boston, very little of their work was involved, possibly because almost all of the women that were in the WCTU were in these other organizations, so that their work tended to be there rather than in the WCTU, and the WCTU reserved its work for temperance agitation. But the members, the same members, you would find them in, say, for example, either the Y, probably the Y, and second in the Women's Educational Industrial Union if you were to cross-check membership lists.
I just want to say I'm really very impressed by this. I'm delighted to see somebody who makes really good use of that Boston Educational Industrial Union. Right when I was supporting my dissertation, ran across all those papers and grabbed it and couldn't figure out what I could do with it. I'm glad somebody...
It's a gold mine. It really is.
That was very good period.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd make a comparison between the women's movement, the agenda sounds almost the same as the present agenda, between that movement in the 1880s and the present women's movement, either qualitatively or quantitatively, if they're at least become something.
Well, you know, when I started to do this research, this is one of the things that drew me to it, was the sense that it was very compatible with the current agenda, especially the concentration on women's new roles in the workplace. Because I remember in the late 60s and 1970s, that was what most interested me, not the ERA, but the sense that I would be working outside the home and how I had to adapt to that. But secondly, some of even just the finer points of this information impressed me. For example, I found organizations in these cities that were designed what we would call as shelters for battered women. There was an organization in Chicago called the Agency for the Protection of Women and Children, which actually did the identical kind of social service women work for women who were in physically dangerous situations in their homes. And, I had been studying women's history for many years and had never seen one reference to that. And my sense is that it's this kind of history of social service that we'll see much more continuity over the century than we see actually differences or breaches. I do think, however, that the larger political climate, say, of women's suffrage or of equal rights amendment informs this activity. The social service work has a much more explicitly feminist philosophy to it because of these larger political movements. In the 1920s and 1930s, when the political wing of the women's movement is at a quiescent, you don't see many of the services go on, but the kind of philosophy that informs them is very muted. And I think they revive again in the 60s and 70s.
At a different level of sophistication or what?
Well, a different level of sophistication, but I think also an understanding about, well, one, I think our generation has a much more realistic expectation about the permanence of women's place in the workforce, that we as adult women can be expected to be working throughout our entire lives. In the 19th century, that was not true for the majority of women. They saw work as something, a transitional period between dependency on a father and dependency on a husband, but nevertheless an incredibly vital period of women's life. So that a lot of these programs were designed for very young women under the age of 25 who would withdraw from the workforce and do other types of activity. So I think that is one of the probably the major differences in the clientele, that they reached out to a younger rather than to women across the board, as we know now, are always going to be involved at some point, either intermittently or continuously throughout their lives.
Isn't it true that some of the early suffragettes, such as Susan B. Anthony, really went into the suffragette movement in order to achieve the economic independence of women?
Yes, I think they began that way, but I think many of them, like Anthony herself, lost that perspective and became very single-mindedly attached to winning the ballot, and then everything else would change. Whereas many of these women supported the ballot, but they believed that would be good, but you had to do the immediate work of social services, that you couldn't just depend on the ballot changing all these things. And they were right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.